Hi Angels! This is Strength Beyond Powers by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. When a mysterious global event causes all quirks to vanish overnight, the students of Class 1A and pro heroes alike are left powerless. As villains take advantage of the chaos, Izuku and his classmates must rely on their training, wits, and teamwork to protect the people they've sworn to save. Through intense battles and emotional challenges, the heroes learn that their true strength lies not in their quirks, but in their courage, resilience, and the bonds they share. In the end, they prove that being a hero is about much more than power, it's about heart. Izuku Midoriya woke up to an unsettling silence. It wasn't the lack of noise that bothered him. UA's dorms were always relatively quiet in the early morning, but rather an eerie stillness that seemed to permeate everything. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. Reaching over, he grabbed his phone from the bedside table and noticed it was still early. His fingers tingled slightly, a familiar sensation he had grown used to ever since mastering One for All. Absent-mindedly, Izuku focused, summoning the power that had become so deeply ingrained in his identity. But nothing happened. His body remained still, no familiar surge of energy, no rush of power through his limbs. His heart skipped a beat, and he tried again, furrowing his brow in concentration. Still nothing. A sudden wave of panic seized him. Was something wrong with One for All? Had he somehow lost it overnight? His mind raced with a million worst-case scenarios, but he pushed them aside. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe it was a temporary issue. But when Izuku rushed down the hallway to check on his friends, he wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted him. He found Bakugo outside, his hands clenched into fists, scowling at the empty air in front of him. Sparks should have been flying from his palms, explosions that always seemed to follow him whenever he was worked up, but today, there was nothing. Bakugo, Izuku started cautiously, stepping forward. Are you? Shut up, Deku, Bakugo snapped, his voice low and tense. He gritted his teeth, his frustration palpable. I've already tried. Nothing's happening. Izuku's stomach dropped. If Bakugo couldn't use his quirk, then this wasn't just him. It wasn't One for All acting up. Something bigger was going on. By the time they reached the common room, nearly everyone was awake, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Todoroki sat quietly on the couch, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't need to say anything for Izuku to understand. No fire, no ice. Just an ordinary teenager, like the rest of them. What's happening? Kaminari asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. I can't use my electricity. It's like it's gone. I've tried too, Yaoyorozu added, her expression tight with worry. I couldn't create anything. Aizawa walked in moments later, his usual calm demeanor shaken but still in control. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the uneasy students. I need everyone to gather in the auditorium, he said, his voice level but commanding. Now. The walk to the auditorium felt surreal. Whispers of confusion echoed down the hallways as other students from different classes filed out of their dorms. No one had answers. As they reached the large room, the teachers were already assembled. Even All Might stood among them, looking more grim than usual. His presence, while always a source of inspiration, seemed to carry a different weight today. He was quirkless, but even he looked uneasy. Aizawa took the microphone and spoke with the same authority he always did. This morning, every single quirk in the world seems to have vanished. We don't know why, and we don't know for how long, but this is a global phenomenon. Gasps rippled through the room. Izuku felt his chest tighten. All quirks, gone? How was that even possible? Aizawa continued, we've been in contact with hero agencies across the country. Reports are coming in from every city, heroes, civilians, even villains. Everyone is affected. For a moment, silence filled the room as the weight of Aizawa's words sank in. A world without quirks. It was unthinkable, and yet, here they were, living it. Izuku's mind raced as he processed the implications. Without quirks, heroes couldn't perform their duties. They couldn't fight villains, couldn't protect civilians the way they had trained their whole lives to do. What would happen to society? He looked around at his classmates, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Bakuga sat with his arms crossed, glaring at the floor, his fists trembling. Todoroki seemed contemplative, his gaze distant. Shinso, standing near the back, wore a small, almost imperceptible smile. Izuku couldn't blame him, losing his brainwashing quirk might have felt like a weight lifted off his shoulders. Before anyone could speak up, All Might stepped forward. "I know this is frightening," he began, his voice steady. "But remember this, being a hero isn't about your quirk. It's about your heart. Your courage. Your willingness to protect others, no matter the circumstances." Izuku nodded, feeling a sense of reassurance, even as the reality of the situation sank in deeper. He had been quirkless once before, he knew how to live without powers. But for most of his classmates, this was uncharted territory. Suddenly, the large screen behind Aizawa flickered to life, broadcasting a news report. The headline was stark: "Villains take advantage of quirkless chaos." "Villains are attacking cities across the nation, looting and causing destruction," the reporter's voice said urgently. "With heroes unable to stop them, it's unclear how law enforcement will manage." A sinking feeling settled in Izuku's stomach. It was only a matter of time before villains exploited this situation. Without quirks, the heroes were on equal footing with everyone else. "We need to act fast," Aizawa said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're still heroes, quirks or not. We'll rely on physical training, strategy, and teamwork to protect the people. Starting today, we're going to teach you how to fight without powers." The room was quiet as the weight of his words settled over them. No one dared speak, not even Bakugo, who usually had something snarky to say. The reality was sinking in, they were no longer superhuman. They were just ordinary people in a world that still expected them to be heroes. Izuku took a deep breath. He had spent his whole life dreaming of having a quirk, and now, the one thing he had wished for was gone. But All Might's words echoed in his mind: "It's not about the power. It's about your heart." As the meeting adjourned, the students filed out, heads low, conversations hushed. Izuku lingered behind, glancing out the window at the clear morning sky. The world outside looked the same as always, but everything had changed. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: quirks or not, they would still be heroes. The once bustling training grounds of UA felt strangely empty, without the usual flashes of quirks being activated. Instead, the sound of footsteps and quiet conversations filled the space as Class 1A assembled in front of Aizawa, who stood with his arms crossed, waiting for them to fall into place. "I know this situation is overwhelming," Aizawa began, his voice sharp but calm. "But that doesn't change our mission. We're heroes, quirks or not, and there are people depending on us. Today, we're going to focus on using our other abilities: strategy, teamwork, and combat skills." Izuku, standing at the front of the group, nodded to himself. He had always admired Aizawa for his ability to stay composed in any situation, but today, it felt more important than ever. If Aizawa could remain calm without his erasure quirk, then they could find a way to adapt too. "Pair up," Aizawa instructed, "and we'll start with basic hand-to-hand combat. No quirks. Just your physical strength and what you've learned so far." The class quickly broke into pairs. Izuku found himself partnered with Todoroki, who looked uncharacteristically contemplative. Normally, Todoroki would have relied heavily on his quirk to gain an advantage in combat, but now, it was just the two of them, standing on equal ground. "How are you feeling about all this?" Izuku asked, taking his stance. Todoroki mirrored him, his expression distant. I've spent so much time thinking about my quirk, Todoroki said quietly, his voice almost lost in the noise of the other students practicing. About how it defines me, about my father. Now, I don't know what to feel. Maybe this is freeing, in a way. Izuku understood. He had spent years wishing for a quirk, believing that without one, he couldn't be a hero. Now, they were all quirkless, and it felt strange to be back in that place of uncertainty, even though he knew he was more than his powers. Todoroki suddenly lunged forward, throwing a punch aimed at Izuku's shoulder. Reflexively, Izuku blocked, deflecting the strike and pivoting to the side. Without quirks, it was a test of speed and technique, no fire, no ice, just raw skill. The two traded blows, each movement calculated and precise. Despite the lack of their usual abilities, the intensity of the sparring session pushed them both to their limits. By the end, they were both panting, drenched in sweat. You're still fast, Todoroki said between breaths, wiping his forehead. Even without your quirk. Izuku smiled weakly. I've always had to rely on my body more than most. I guess it's an advantage now. Nearby, Bakugo and Kirishima sparred with equal intensity, though Bakugo's frustration was clear in every movement. He fought with a kind of wild aggression, each punch thrown harder than the last. Damn it! Bakugo shouted, throwing a kick that Kirishima barely managed to block. I can't do anything without my explosions. Kirishima, ever the calm counterpart to Bakugo's fury, gritted his teeth as he absorbed the impact. We just have to adjust, man. It's not like anyone else can use their quirks either. Bakugo snarled, his frustration boiling over. Adjust? That's easy for you to say. I'm supposed to be the best, and now I can't even fight properly. Aizawa, watching from the sidelines, stepped in. Bakugo, calm down. Relying on your quirk isn't what makes you strong. You've always had physical strength and battle instincts. Focus on those. Bakugo glared at Aizawa but didn't argue. Instead, he took a deep breath, his fists clenching and unclenching as he tried to rein in his frustration. The day wore on, each student pushing themselves harder than ever, not just physically, but mentally. Without their quirks, they had to find new ways to approach every situation. Some, like Kirishima and Shiro, took to the challenge quickly, adapting with surprising ease. Others, like Bakugo and Kaminari, struggled to adjust to their new limitations. But Izuku couldn't help noticing that someone seemed unusually calm amidst the chaos, Shinso. The dark-haired student, often quiet and reserved, seemed more at ease than ever before. His brainwashing quirk had always been a source of discomfort for him, something that set him apart from others. Now, with the playing field leveled, Shinso's usual unease seemed to have lifted. After the training session, as the students sat down to rest and rehydrate, Izuku approached Shinso, curious about his perspective. You seem different today, Izuku said, sitting down next to him. Less tense, I guess. Shinso looked at him, a small smile playing on his lips. It's weird, right? Everyone's freaking out because they lost their quirks, but for me, I don't know. I always felt like my quirk was more of a burden than a blessing. People judged me for it, assumed I was some kind of villain because of what I could do. But now, it doesn't matter anymore. Izuku nodded thoughtfully. I never thought about it like that. I guess for some people, losing their quirks isn't as bad as it seems. Shinso shrugged. I'm not saying it's easy. But I've spent so much time trying to prove that I'm more than my quirk. Now I don't have to prove anything. We're all on the same level. Before Izuku could respond, Aizawa's voice called out to the class. Gather around. We have some updates. The students quickly regrouped, forming a semicircle around Aizawa, who looked as serious as ever. There's been an increase in villain activity in nearby cities, he said bluntly. Without quirks, the villains think they can take control. But we're still heroes, and we're going to protect the people, with or without powers. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. Villains were always a threat, but without their quirks, the heroes would have to rely on pure strategy and teamwork to keep the upper hand. This was no longer a world where brute force would win the day. Starting tomorrow, Aizawa continued, we're going to focus on group strategy. It's not about individual strength anymore. You're going to need to rely on each other more than ever. The weight of his words settled over the group. They were used to working as a team, but the dynamic had changed completely. Without quirks, the strategies that had once defined them had to be rethought from the ground up. As the students began to disperse, preparing to head back to the dorms, Izuku caught sight of Bakugo, still fuming on the sidelines. His pride had taken a hit, and it was clear he wasn't handling the situation well. Before Izuku could approach, Todoroki stepped forward, cutting through the tension with a calm presence. Bakugo, he said quietly, you're more than just your explosions. You've always been a fighter. Don't forget that. Bakugo glared at him, his fists still clenched. I don't need a pep talk from you, icy hot. Todoroki shrugged, unfazed by the insult. I'm not giving you a pep talk. I'm telling you the truth. There was a beat of silence before Bakugo finally sighed, his anger deflating just a little. Whatever. As they made their way back to the dorms, Izuku found himself lost in thought. The world had changed overnight, and they were all scrambling to adjust. But if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that Aizawa was right. Being a hero wasn't about the power they had, it was about the choices they made. Quirks or no quirks, they would find a way to protect the people. It was who they were, after all. The atmosphere at UA had shifted. It wasn't just the loss of quirks that hung heavy over the school, it was the growing sense of unease as reports of villain activity continued to flood in. Cities were being targeted, not by the usual powered villains, but by ordinary people taking advantage of the chaos. Without heroes to keep the peace, law and order were fraying at the edges. Aizawa gathered Class 1A in the strategy room, a large, spacious area with a central table surrounded by screens. The students filed in, quieter than usual, their faces lined with tension. Even the usual banter between friends had all but disappeared. Take a seat, Aizawa said, his voice sharp and no-nonsense as always. Izuku slid into a chair beside Todoroki and Kirishima, glancing around at his classmates. Bakugo sat with his arms crossed, glaring at the table. Shinso leaned against the wall at the back, looking more relaxed than the others, but Izuku knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure got to everyone. We've received information that a group of villains has taken control of the east side of the city, Aizawa began. They're not powered anymore, but they're organized, and they're using the confusion to loot and terrorize civilians. Tension rippled through the room. Izuku felt his stomach knot. Even without quirks, villains were dangerous. Organized crime had always been a problem, but now the lines between petty criminals and real threats were blurring. The fact that they no longer had quirks didn't seem to slow them down. Normally, this would be a job for the pro-heroes, Aizawa continued. But with so many of them unable to use their quirks, the agencies are stretched thin. We're going to step in. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Aizawa had said what they all feared, even without their powers, they were still expected to act as heroes. But we don't have our quirks. Kaminari blurted out, his voice tinged with panic. How are we supposed to fight villains without them? Aizawa's eyes narrowed. Your quirks don't define you. You're still heroes. You've been trained for situations like this, hand-to-hand combat, tactics, teamwork. You need to rely on those skills now more than ever. Izuku's heart raced. He had always known that being a hero was more than just having powers, but now that they were facing real threats without their abilities, the weight of those words felt heavier. Izawa pulled up a map on the large screen behind him, highlighting several areas of the city. We're splitting into teams. Your job is to evacuate civilians, assess the situation, and, if necessary, engage the villains. You'll be working alongside the police force and quirkless pro-heroes. As he assigned teams, Izuku found himself paired with Bakugo, Todoroki, and Shinso. It was an odd mix, Bakugo's raw aggression, Todoroki's calm precision, Shinso's quiet strategic mind, but if anyone could make it work, it was them. Your objective, Izawa continued, looking directly at their group, is to secure the shopping district. There's a large group of civilians trapped inside, and reports suggest several armed villains have taken over the area. We don't know their numbers, so you'll need to be careful. Bakugo scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Armed? Quirks or not, I'll take them down. Bakugo, this isn't the time to be reckless, Todoroki interjected, his voice measured. Without our quirks, we need to approach this differently. I know that, icy hot. Bakugo shot back, his eyes flashing with frustration. I'm not stupid. We're still going to take them down, quirks or not. Shinso, who had been quiet throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. We need to think like them. They've lost their quirks too, so they're going to rely on fear and intimidation. If we keep our heads, we can outsmart them. Izuku nodded in agreement, though a small part of him felt the pressure mounting. They had trained for years to be heroes, but now everything felt different. No matter how much they told themselves that quirks didn't make them heroes, the loss of that power was hard to ignore. Izawa dismissed the class, and they quickly geared up in their hero costumes, which now felt more like armor than symbols of power. Izuku's costume felt strangely light without the energy of one for all coursing through him. As they made their way to the city, the usually bustling streets were eerily quiet, a sign of how quickly the chaos had spread. The shopping district was in disarray when they arrived. Shops were boarded up, and the few people on the streets looked nervous, darting glances at every shadow. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the air, a reminder that the city was unraveling faster than they could keep up. Izuku's heart raced as they approached the center of the district. It didn't take long to spot the villains, about a dozen of them, armed with makeshift weapons, patrolling the area. Without their quirks, they looked more like desperate thugs than the supervillains they once were. All right, Shinso whispered, crouching behind a parked car with the rest of the team. We need a plan. Bakugo, for once, didn't argue. He was clearly struggling with the absence of his usual power, but he hadn't lost his tactical edge. We need to divide them. Hit them from two sides. Todoroki nodded, his eyes scanning the area. We can use the buildings for cover. If we move quietly, we can take out their sentries first. Izuku swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had spent years studying hero tactics, analyzing every move, every possible scenario. Now, all of that knowledge had to come into play. I'll lead the civilians out, Izuku offered. Once we've cleared the area, we can focus on taking them down. But we need to be fast. If they see us coming, it'll turn into a fight we can't afford to lose. They all nodded in agreement, and the plan took shape. Todoroki and Shinso would create a distraction, drawing the attention of the main group of villains, while Izuku and Bakugo moved in to evacuate the civilians trapped inside the shopping center. As they moved into position, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that came with being quirkless again. But there was no time for doubt. They had a job to do, and people were depending on them. Todoroki and Shinso moved first, slipping through the shadows until they reached the edge of the villains' patrol. Shinso threw a rock, and it clattered against the pavement, drawing the attention of two nearby thugs. As they turned toward the noise, Todoroki stepped out from behind a wall and sprinted toward them. Without his fire or ice, it was pure speed and precision. In a matter of moments, Todoroki had disarmed one villain, while Shinso used his physical training to subdue the other. It was quick, efficient, and completely silent. Go, Shinso hissed into the communicator. We've got them distracted. Izuku and Bakuga didn't hesitate. They darted across the open space, toward the shopping center's entrance. Inside, a small group of civilians huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. We're here to help, Izuku whispered, gesturing for them to follow. Stay low and move fast. The civilians scrambled to their feet, relief washing over their faces as they followed Izuku and Bakuga toward the back exit. But just as they reached the door, a shout echoed through the building. Hey! They're getting away! One of the villains had spotted them. Izuku's heart pounded as the situation turned from a rescue mission into a race against time. Bakuga's eyes narrowed, his body tense with the instinct to fight, but without his explosions, they couldn't risk a direct confrontation. We've got to move, Izuku urged, his voice tight with urgency. We can't let them block the exit. As they sprinted toward safety, Izuku realized just how precarious their situation was. Without Quirks, every decision had to be perfect. There was no room for error. But as they finally burst through the back exit, the sound of footsteps behind them, Izuku knew one thing for sure, they were still heroes, with or without powers. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets as Izuku, Bakuga, and a group of civilians scrambled through the back exit of the shopping center. The sound of the villain's shout still echoed in Izuku's ears, and the adrenaline surged through his veins. They had to move fast. Without Quirks, there was no guarantee of escape if the villains caught up. Move! Bakuga barked at the civilians, though he kept his voice low enough to avoid drawing more attention. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, evident in the clenched fists at his sides, but he was keeping it together, barely. Head for the alley, Izuku urged, scanning their surroundings. The alley would give them cover until Todoroki and Shinso could finish taking down the other villains. They had to buy time, just a little longer. The civilians, eyes wide with fear, obeyed, huddling together as they made their way toward the narrow alley that led out of the shopping district. Izuku followed close behind, his heart hammering in his chest. He had never felt so vulnerable. Without One for All, without the power that had become such an intrinsic part of him, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't since before he became a hero. Bakuga fell in step beside him, his eyes scanning the area, jaw tight. Deku, how long do you think we have until they catch up? Izuku glanced back, his mind racing. Not long. But we're almost there. If we can just... A loud crash interrupted him. The back door of the shopping center was flung open, and three of the villains burst out, brandishing makeshift weapons. They weren't using quirks, but they didn't need to. Without powers, the playing field had been leveled. There they are, one of the villains shouted, raising a crowbar as he charged forward. Izuku's stomach dropped. He and Bakuga stood between the civilians and the villains, and there was no time to think, only act. Without their powers, they couldn't rely on brute force. It would be a battle of wits and raw physical strength. We've got this, Izuku said, his voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at him. Bakuga, stay with me. Don't tell me what to do. Bakuga snapped, though there was no real bite to his words. The two fell into position, their backs to the civilians, ready to defend. The first villain lunged at Bakuga, swinging the crowbar with reckless abandon. Bakuga ducked, his movements sharp and precise, before landing a well-placed punch to the villain's gut. Even without his explosions, Bakuga had spent years honing his physical strength. The villain crumpled to the ground, winded but not out. Izuku was facing two villains at once. One had a broken pipe, the other a knife. His mind raced as he dodged their swings, barely managing to stay out of range. Without his quirk to augment his speed or strength, he had to rely on the combat training he'd received at UA. He blocked a blow from the pipe, feeling the sting of the impact vibrate through his forearm, but he quickly countered with a swift kick to the villain's knee, sending him stumbling backward. The one with the knife lunged forward, and Izuku dodged to the side, his movements slower than he would have liked, but effective. Bakugo, having finished off his opponent, turned just in time to help. "Move, Deku," he shouted, and Izuku ducked as Bakugo threw a punch at the knife-wielding villain, disarming him in one clean motion. "We're not finished yet." Bakugo growled as the villains struggled to their feet, but their morale was clearly wavering. With their quirks gone, they didn't have the overwhelming advantage they once did. Before the villains could regroup, Todoroki and Shinso appeared at the end of the alley, having finished their own fights. Todoroki looked a little bruised, but otherwise fine. Shinso was catching his breath, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "Let's wrap this up," Shinso said, his voice calm but commanding. He gestured for Bakugo and Todoroki to flank the villains, while he and Izuku stood between them and the civilians. The villains exchanged uneasy glances. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and clearly hadn't expected this level of resistance without quirks. One of them, the leader, spat on the ground, glaring at the students. "Just because you brats don't have powers anymore, doesn't mean you can stop us," the leader snarled. "We've got the numbers, and we're not going to let some wannabe heroes." He was cut off by Bakugo, who stepped forward with an intense, almost feral grin. "You think we need quirks to take you down? You're even dumber than you look." Todoroki stepped up beside him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Bakugo's aggression. "This doesn't need to get any worse for you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Walk away while you still can." The tension hung in the air for a moment, the villains weighing their options. But as the seconds ticked by, it became clear they knew they were outmatched, even without quirks. With a final growl of frustration, the leader motioned for his group to retreat. They turned and fled back into the chaos of the shopping district, disappearing into the shadows. Bakugo let out a low, disappointed huff. "Cowards." Izuku exhaled a long breath of relief. The civilians behind him were safe, and the villains were gone, for now. "We did it," Todoroki said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. He looked down at his hands, still half expecting fire or ice to emerge. But nothing came. They had won without their powers, using only their training and teamwork. "Of course we did it," Bakugo grumbled, though Izuku could see a flicker of pride in his eyes. "We don't need those damn quirks to be better than those losers." Shinso stepped forward, offering Izuku a small nod. "Good work, Midoriya. You held it together." Izuku smiled, though he felt the weight of the battle settling into his bones. It hadn't been easy. Every moment, he had been acutely aware of how different things were now, how much more vulnerable they were without their powers. But they had done it. They had protected people, just like heroes were supposed to. A sudden crackle from Izuku's communicator broke the silence. Aizawa's voice came through, steady and firm. "Report." "We secured the civilians," Izuku answered, feeling the adrenaline begin to ebb. "The villains retreated." "Good. The police are on their way. Stay with the civilians until they arrive." Izuku nodded, though Aizawa couldn't see it. "Yes, sir." As they waited for the authorities, the reality of the situation began to sink in. They had faced villains, saved civilians, and come out on top, all without their quirks. It was a victory, but it felt different from the victories they were used to. There was no flashy display of power, no overwhelming strength. Just raw determination, skill, and teamwork. As the sirens of approaching police cars grew louder, Todoroki spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe this is what we needed, to see that we're more than our quirks." Izuku glanced at him, nodding slowly. "Yeah. We've trained so hard for this, maybe we relied on them too much." Bakugo scoffed, though his usual fire seemed tempered. "Doesn't matter. Quirks or not, we'll always be the best." Shinso smiled faintly. "You sound like you're convincing yourself." Bakuga shot him a glare, but it lacked the usual heat. The group fell into a companionable silence as the police arrived to take over. For the first time since the world had changed, Izuku felt a sense of peace. They had proven to themselves, and to the world, that they could still be heroes. Powers or no powers, they were ready to face whatever came next. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over UA's grounds as Class 1A gathered in the common room. The tension from the day's battle had faded, replaced by an exhausted camaraderie. They had faced their first major challenge without their quirks and come out on top. But even with the victory, something had shifted inside each of them. Izuku sat on one of the couches, nursing a bottle of water and watching as his classmates slowly filed in, their movements sluggish but their spirits undeniably high. Bakuga leaned against a wall, his arms crossed, though his usual scowl had softened just a bit. Todoroki sat beside Izuku, quiet as ever, but there was a calmness in his posture that hadn't been there before. Shinso stood off to the side, a small smile tugging at his lips as he watched the class settle into a sense of normalcy again. For the first time since the quirks had disappeared, things almost felt normal. "That was one hell of a day," Kirishima said, collapsing onto the couch across from Izuku, a wide grin on his face. "Who knew we could pull off something like that without our powers?" "Speak for yourself," Bakuga muttered. "It wasn't exactly easy." "But we did it," Mina chimed in, her voice bright. "We saved those people, and we didn't even need our quirks." "I guess we proved Aizawa right," Zero added, leaning back in his chair. "We're more than our powers." Izuku smiled softly, taking it all in. They had all grown so much in such a short amount of time, and not just as heroes, but as people. The loss of their quirks had forced them to confront something they had never truly faced before, who they were without the one thing that had defined them for so long. As the chatter continued around him, Izuku found himself lost in thought. He had spent so much of his life believing that he needed a quirk to be a hero, that without it, he was destined to be powerless and insignificant. But today had changed that. Today, they had faced down villains, protected civilians, and worked together in ways they hadn't before. It had been about more than strength or speed, it had been about heart, courage, and resilience. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through his thoughts. "Midoriya," Aizawa said as he entered the room, drawing the attention of the entire class. "There's been an update." The students immediately fell silent, their eyes trained on their teacher as he stood before them, his usual stern expression softened ever so slightly. All Might entered the room behind him, looking as calm and reassuring as ever. Aizawa folded his arms, his gaze sweeping over the group. "As of an hour ago, quirks have returned." A stunned silence filled the room. For a few moments, no one spoke, as if they were processing what Aizawa had just said. Then, as if on cue, the air in the room shifted. Bakuga glanced at his hands, flexing his fingers, and a small spark of an explosion crackled from his palm. Todoroki lifted his hand, and a flicker of fire danced at his fingertips, followed by a thin layer of ice forming along his other palm. The murmur started immediately. Quirks had returned. The power they had lost, had learned to live without, was back. "Just like that?" Kaminari asked, looking at his hands, electricity beginning to crackle between his fingers. "They just came back?" Aizawa nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. "We don't know why or how it happened. There's no explanation for why quirks disappeared in the first place, and no explanation for their return. But they're back." All Might stepped forward, his usual warm smile in place as he addressed the class. "I know this has been a challenging time for all of you. You've been forced to adapt, to face situations without the powers that you've relied on for so long. And I've never been prouder." His words seemed to hang in the air, carrying a weight that made Izuku sit up straighter. "Being a hero," All Might continued, his voice strong, "has never been about the strength of your quirk. It's about the strength of your heart, your willingness to protect others, no matter the circumstances. And today, you proved that you are all heroes, with or without your powers. Izuku felt a swell of pride in his chest as All Might's words sank in. The events of the past few days had been overwhelming, confusing, and frightening, but they had also shown him, and all of them, that they were more than the power they wielded. They had learned to be heroes in the truest sense of the word. But remember, Aizawa cut in, his tone serious. Just because your quirks are back doesn't mean you should forget what you've learned. Relying too heavily on your powers can make you careless. Don't lose the skills you've gained. The students nodded in agreement, the weight of Aizawa's words sinking in. They had become stronger in ways that went beyond their quirks. This wasn't just about having powers, it was about knowing how to be heroes, no matter what. After Aizawa and All Might dismissed them, the students lingered, testing their quirks as if rediscovering them for the first time. The energy in the room was lighter, more hopeful, but there was also a new understanding beneath it all. They had grown. They had changed. As the crowd began to thin, Todoroki turned to Izuku, a thoughtful look in his eyes. I think losing our quirks was the best thing that could have happened to us. Izuku looked at him, surprised. Really? Todoroki nodded slowly. We learned that we're more than our powers. We learned how to fight without them, how to work together in ways we haven't before. It's made us better. Yeah, Izuku agreed, feeling the weight of Todoroki's words settle over him. You're right. I think it's made me realize that I don't need to rely on one for all as much as I thought I did. Todoroki smiled faintly. Exactly. Bakugo, who had been listening from nearby, huffed. TCH. You two are getting too sentimental. We're back, and we're stronger than ever. That's all that matters. Shinso, standing by the doorway, shot Bakugo an amused look. Stronger, sure. But I think we're smarter too. Bakugo rolled his eyes but didn't argue, and that alone was a sign that things had changed. As the group began to disperse, Izuku found himself looking out the window at the quiet, peaceful night. The world had been turned upside down, but now, standing here with his friends, he realized something important. No matter what happened, no matter how much things changed, they would always find a way to adapt, to grow, to protect the people they cared about. Quirks or no quirks, they were heroes. That would never change. And as they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, Izuku knew one thing for certain, they were ready. They always had been. This is the end of Strength Beyond Powers by the Angel Demon on AO3. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any suggestion, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out.